Chapter 1. Stephen sighed as he watched the world go by. I still don't see why we have to move, he told his wife as he turned to look at her. Because honey, the company is opening a new store in Stepford and they asked me to run it, Emily replied, not taking her eyes off the road. Besides, the offer was too good to turn down and the house came as part of the job, Emily continued. I thought that you'd be proud of me, she added. And I am. Really, Stephen added as his wife gave him a look. I just don't see why we have to move. All our friends and family are back at home and I had to leave my job. I mean, what am I supposed to do when we get there? I'm sure that you'll be able to find something, sweetie, Emily replied. You've got good qualifications. You'll find something in no time. And hey, worst comes to worst, you can always work at the store with me. Stephen laughed. Thanks, but no thanks, he told her. You know that I'm not suited to that sort of work. Emily shrugged her shoulders. Suit yourself, she said as they both fell silent on the matter. The drive to Stepford was long and windy. Stepford was a small community out into the country and the only way to get there was through narrow country roads. They took it in turns to drive parts of the route, but Emily insisted that she drove the last part. Here we are, Emily announced finally. Stephen awoke from his nap just as they saw a sign pointing to the town. Emily turned the vehicle down the road. Wow, she said as they rounded the corner. The road they were on was surrounded by trees. It reminded Stephen of something out of a fantasy movie. He had to admit that it did look very dramatic. Heading further into the town, they saw that all the roads were decorated in a similar fashion and every house was just as immaculate. It seemed so perfect. Almost too perfect, Stephen thought to himself. And here's our house, Emily announced as she pulled over. Stephen's jaw dropped. This was theirs? The house was amazing. It was more like a mansion than a house to Stephen. How can we afford this? Stephen asked, turning to look at his wife. She just smiled at him. I told you. The company's paying for it. They're so confident that the store will be successful that they offered it as an enticement to anyone who took the job. That's one of the reasons that I applied, Emily explained as she took out her phone. What are you doing? Stephen asked curiously. Well, I got an email from the members of the council before we left. They wanted to meet us as soon as we arrived. I was just replying to let them know that we're here. Stephen nodded. That's nice of them, he commented as Emily soon got a response. What did they say? They've given us directions to the country house and have offered us lunch if we're hungry. Stephen's stomach growled in coincidence and they both laughed. I guess that's a yes then, Emily said, chuckling as she started the engine up. Chapter 2. There was a roar of laughter as Stephen and Emily entered the clubhouse. They looked towards the source and in a large open lounge there were 4 women sitting in armchairs. What surprised the young couple was that a couple of the women were smoking cigars. Also, their attire struck them as odd. They were all wearing business suits and their hairstyles were short and almost masculine. Stephen looked at his wife, who looked just as confused as one of the women put down her wine glass and stood up. Ah, you must be Emily and Stephen, she stated as she approached them. Yes. That's us, Stephen replied, offering to shake her hand. The woman just smiled and nodded. Splendid, splendid, she said as she took Emily's hand and shook it. I hope you're hungry? She asked as she gestured for them to sit down. Stephen looked again at his wife, who just shrugged her shoulders as she followed the woman. "Yes, we are actually," she replied. "Excellent," the woman replied as she picked up a bell and rang it. A few moments later a butler appeared, but like the women, she was a bit odd. The butler bowed as she entered. She wore the traditional butler's uniform along with the white gloves. Her hair was also cropped short. "Jenkins, could kindly set the table ready for our guests?" the woman who greeted them ordered. The butler nodded. "Of course, madam." She bowed again before closing the doors behind her. "I'm sorry, where are my manners?" "My name is Fiona Masters," the woman said, finally introducing herself. "And these fine gentlewomen are Gemma Rhodes, Olivia Gordon, and Rebecca Hamilton." The three women nodded in greeting. "Gemma here owns the club," Fiona continued. "Oh, it's very nice," Emily commented, earning a smile from the older woman. She turned to look at her husband, who was staring at all four of the women. Emily rolled her eyes and nudged him. "Huh?" he asked as he looked around. "Oh, yes. It's very impressive." Stephen noticed two of the women exchange glances with each other. He was about to confront them about it when the butler reappeared. "Dinner is ready," she announced. "Excellent," Fiona Masters said as she stood up, fastening one of the buttons on her suit. The other women did the same. Stephen and Emily followed the women through to the main dining hall. Like everything else that they had seen, the dining hall was spectacularly decorated. The butler showed them each to their seats. Chapter 3. "Would you two like something to drink?" Fiona asked them. "I'll have a large beer, please," Stephen requested. He noted the two women exchange a smirk again but decided to ignore it. "I'll just have a glass of white wine," Emily said. Fiona nodded and snapped her fingers before adding, "and the usual for U.S. Jenkins." "Well, I hope that you'll like living here in Stepford," Fiona continued. She seemed to be the leader of the group. The other three hardly said anything. "Yes, it all looks very nice," Emily replied. "I can't wait to start work." Fiona nodded. As the butler came round with their drinks. "And what do you think, Mr. Thompson?" Fiona asked, drawing their attention once more to Stephen. "Well, as my wife said, it's a very nice place," he started. "I haven't got anything planned yet, but I hope to find a job very soon." "I'm sure you will," Fiona replied with a knowing look in her eye. Stephen ignored the other women. "I'm very glad that your company decided to set up shop here in Stepford, Mrs. Thompson," Fiona said, continuing the conversation. "It's been a while since we've had any new business in town, and our local store is only really a small convenience store." "Yes, so I heard," Emily replied. "But don't worry, our stores provide everything that you need. My only concern is the supplies." "You say that the route we came in is the only point of access?" "Oh, don't worry about that," Fiona Masters replied. "We're actually planning on expanding the town a bit. Rebecca's actually in charge of the construction." "Indeed," Rebecca added, finally speaking up. "We plan on adding a few new roads into the town very soon, but as you understand, it could take a while." Emily nodded. "That's good to hear, and actually, if you require any more workforce, I'm sure my husband wouldn't mind lending a hand," she added, nudging Stephen in the ribs. "Oh yes, actually my last job was in construction," Stephen told them. Rebecca leaned forward and whispered to her companion. After a lengthy discussion, she leaned back. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Thompson, but I think that we have enough staff at the moment." However, if you wish, you can send in an application form tomorrow and we'll consider it. Stephen opened his mouth to say something, but Emily tapped him and shook her head. At that moment, the butler returned along with some waitresses. "Dinner is served," she told them. "Excellent!" Fiona exclaimed. "I hope that you both like steak." Chapter 4. Well, that was odd, Stephen commented as he carried the last of the bags into the house. "Did you notice the way those women were dressed?" he asked his wife. "I did," Emily replied. "But who are we to judge? It's a small community and they could think the same way about us." Stephen looked at his wife before shrugging his shoulders. She did have a point. "And what about those 3 women?" he continued. "They hardly said a word through dinner and they all seemed to ignore me. It's like they only wanted to talk to you." Emily sighed as she put her bag down. "Oh, come on, honey," she said as she explored the kitchen. "I'm sure you're just imaging things." "Well then, how do you explain where all the men are?" Stephen asked. "We haven't seen one man since we've arrived," Emily shrugged. "They're probably out working," she suggested. "It's a Sunday," Stephen pointed out. "And when I offered to help them out, they just dismissed as if I wasn't worth their while." "I'm sure they have their reasons," Emily told him. "Now come on, why don't we unpack?" she suggested, grabbing a suitcase and heading upstairs. Stephen frowned. Why was his wife being so defensive? Did she know something that he didn't? He shook his head and dismissed it as her wanting to make a good impression. He picked up the other suitcase and followed her upstairs. Chapter 5. I wonder who that could be? Emily pondered as they heard the doorbell ring as they just finished unpacking. Stephen shrugged as they headed downstairs. "Oh, hello," the woman outside said as the couple opened the door. "I'm Natalie Goodman," she said, extending her hand out. "I guess we're your new neighbors," she told them. "Very nice to meet you," Emily said as she shook Natalie's hand. Stephen offered his, but Natalie ignored him. Stephen frowned but decided not to make a scene. "My husband would love to meet you both, I'm sure, but I'm afraid he's out with some friends. We didn't know what time you would be arriving." "Ah, yes. It was a long journey," Emily explained. "Would you like to come in?" she offered. Natalie shook her head. "No, thank you. I can't stay long. I've got some things to do," she explained. "I'll let my husband know that you're here though. I'm sure that he would love to come over and chat for a bit." "You know how men are," she said, winking at Emily. Both of them just looked at her confused. Seeing their reactions, Natalie coughed. "Oh, well, yes. Must dash. See you soon," she said as she gave them a wave before heading back down the drive. What did she mean by that? Stephen asked rather crossly as soon as the door was shut. "I'm sure that she didn't mean anything by it, dear," Emily replied. "But it was very odd. I'm not sure that I like her." Finally, something that we agree on, Stephen thought to himself. "Still," Stephen continued, "I still think something strange is going on here. And I want to find out what it is," he said as they headed into the kitchen to put the kettle on. Chapter 6. Stephen and Emily both went to bed early that night. They had spent a long time traveling and Emily had to get up the next morning to start her new job. Emily fell asleep straight away, but Stephen stayed awake thinking about all the strange things that he had seen. What was with the way the women dressed? And where were all the men? Sure, Natalie Goodman had explained that his husband was out with some friends, but that didn't account for the rest of them. Unless they all knew each other and were all out together. That seemed to make some sense, Stephen thought. It did seem a very tight community and everyone probably knew everyone. With that last thought, Stephen finally drifted off to sleep. "Hold him down," a voice shouted, waking Stephen up with a start. "What's going on?" Stephen asked as he shook the sleep off and tried to get his bearings. "Welcome to Stepford, Mr. Thompson," the voice told him. Stephen recognized that voice, and as his vision cleared he saw Fiona Masters standing over him with a wicked grin on her face. She was surrounded by other women in lab coats. "We're ready, madam," one of the scientists said to Fiona Masters. She nodded. "Good. Begin the process," she commanded. The scientist nodded and moved over to a console and began flipping some switches. It was only then that Stephen noticed that there were some wires attached to his brain. "What's going on?" he asked again, looking directly at Fiona. "Allow me to explain, Mr. Thompson," Fiona said with a smirk. "You may have how things work around here," she said as she began pacing around the room. "All the women are in charge here," she explained. "When our founders founded this little community, it was founded on the belief that women are superior and that the men should be what you call the fairer sex." Stephen looked at her shocked. Now some people came here willingly accepting those beliefs, but for the ones who discovered upon our society by accident, well, we had to come up with something to ensure that our community would not be disturbed. So we had our scientists come up with a way to alter people's brains, Fiona told him. "A process which you are about to go through with," she added with another smirk. "The only downside to this process is that it is slow," Fiona continued with a sigh. "You might not notice anything different at first, but on a subconscious level your brain will already be reacting to the program. What about Emily?" Stephen asked, concerned for his wife, but then he thought back to her defending this place. Did she know about this? To his surprise, Fiona chuckled. "Oh no, my dear," she said, brushing her hand against his cheek. Stephen jerked away quickly. "She had no idea about any of this, but she will eventually. We'll give her a choice." "A choice?" Stephen asked worryingly. Fiona nodded. "Yes. She can either accept what's going on and keep her mind as it is, or we'll have to change her as well," she explained rather menacingly. "The only problem with the second choice is that her personality might alter drastically in the process. She may not be the same loving wife that you fell in love with." "You monster!" Stephen shouted as he struggled against the restraints. Fiona chuckled again as she lit a cigar. "Yes, I have been called that a few times," she said, smiling. "The process is almost complete, madam," one of the scientists told her. "Excellent," she said. She whispered something to the scientist and then everyone left the room. "Enjoy your new life, Mr. Thompson," she said before she closed the door, leaving Stephen in complete darkness alone with the machines whirring away. Chapter 7. Stephen awoke with a start and a cold sweat. He looked around, and as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, it was clear that he was in his own bedroom. He looked beside him, and sure enough, his wife Emily was sound asleep, seemingly undisturbed. Stephen quietly got out of bed and went into the bathroom to wash his face. Once inside, he closed the door and put the light on. He then gripped the edges of the sink. What had just happened? Had it really all happened, or was it just a dream? There was no way that they could have moved him without disturbing Emily, and yet, it all seemed so real. After washing his face, he checked himself in the mirror. He still seemed normal enough. The same chiseled face stared back at him. He shook his head and decided that he'd ask his wife about it in the morning. Switching the light off, he crept silently back into bed. Surprisingly, he drifted off quickly, and when he woke up the next morning, the memories of the night were beginning to fade. Chapter 8: Morning Honey. Emily greeted Stephen cheerily as he entered the kitchen. Stephen was still feeling groggy from last night, so he plunked himself down on a seat at the table while Emily poured him a cup of coffee. Stephen pondered for a moment about whether he should tell Emily about last night and then decided that he should. "Hey, sweetie," he asked, getting her attention. "You didn't notice anything going on last night, did you?" he asked as he took the coffee from her. Emily poured herself some cereal and sat down. "No." "Why?" she asked. Stephen considered her answer for a moment. Normally she was a light sleeper and awoke at the slightest noise. If there really had been people in their room last night, she would have heard it. Stephen shook his head as he sipped on his drink. "No reason." "Are you going to apply for that construction job?" Emily asked him. "I'm not sure," Stephen replied as he grabbed his breakfast. "They didn't really seem keen on the idea, and I might look elsewhere." Emily looked at him. "Really, honey, you can't let other people put you off. They hardly knew you. I'm sure that if you went there determined, then they might change their minds about you." "Maybe you're right," Stephen replied. Although what he had heard last night troubled him, real or not. "Well, either way," Emily said, perking up a bit. "You could go and do some shopping. Here, I've made a list of what we need." She slid him a piece of paper. "All right," Stephen said. "I can do that. It'll give me a chance to explore the town." "That's the spirit, sweetie," Emily said, smiling. She then looked at her watch. "I've got to get going. Don't want to be late on my first day." "Break a leg," Stephen said. Emily blew him a kiss before she left, leaving Stephen to finish his breakfast. Chapter 9. Stephen finished his breakfast and then cleared before heading upstairs to get changed. He wanted to do the shopping quickly, so he hurriedly took a shower and got dressed. Emily had taken the car to work this morning, so Stephen had walk. Fortunately, one of the women from last night had mentioned, more to him, that there was a small grocery shop in the center of town, so he made his way there. Fortunately, Stephen got there early enough and there weren't many people around. He quickly the list that Emily had given him and then proceeded his way down it. After collecting all the items, he pushed his cart to the checkout. Unsurprisingly, there was a woman manning the till. She was dressed similarly to the women back at the clubhouse, and Stephen's mind absently went back to last night. "Can I help you, sir?" a voice said, bringing him out of his reverie. "Huh?" Stephen asked as he came to his senses. He had been so lost in his thoughts that he hadn't realized that he had left the grocery store, and he now found himself staring at a shop window. He turned towards the voice. A woman was looking at him quizzically, and by her uniform he guessed that she worked or maybe owned the shop. "Oh, sorry," Stephen said, embarrassed. "Just looking." The woman gave him a stiff nod as she looked him up and down before entering her shop. What's her problem? Stephen thought as he turned back to what he had been staring at. It was a mannequin, or rather what the mannequin was wearing, to be precise. It was a yellow flower printed dress, and what was more worrying was that Stephen actually thought that it looked rather pretty. Shaking his head, Stephen picked up his bags and quickly hurried back home. He had to talk to Emily when she got home. Stephen made it home without any more distractions. He was fumbling with his keys to the house when he heard someone come up behind him. "Oh, sweetie. Let me help you with that." Chapter 10. Emily pulled into the car park outside her new store. She noted that there was a space that had her name on it. Emily Thompson, manager. She smiled as she saw it. Parking in her spot, she killed the engine and then got out, straightening her skirt as she did so. She had wanted to make a good first impression, so this morning as she got dressed she chose her best skirt suit. After checking her appearance, she strode confidently into the store. To her surprise, she found Fiona Masters inside waiting for her. Fiona smiled when she saw Emily and she approached her. "Ah, Emily. I'm glad that you managed to find the place all right. Is everything all right?" Emily asked. She hadn't expected anyone to meet her. Fiona nodded. "Of course. Everything's going splendidly," she told her with a grin that unnerved Emily. "I just wanted to go over some things with you before you started." "Oh, okay," Emily replied. Fiona gestured towards the offices and Emily started moving in that direction. The next thing that she knew, everything went black. "Huh?" Emily groaned as she began to come to. When her eyes adjusted, she found herself tied to a chair with all sorts of machines surrounding her. She then noticed Fiona Masters standing in front of her along with some women who wore lab coats. "What's going on?" Emily demanded. Fiona, who had been talking to the scientists, turned around. "Aw, Emily, good to see that you're awake." She lit a cigar and then smiled at her. She then began to tell Emily everything that she had told Stephen. Emily could only sit and stare at her in horror as she learned what was in store for her husband. "What about me?" Emily asked, gulping once Fiona had finished. Fiona smiled again as she inhaled her cigar and then blew a big cloud of smoke in Emily's face, causing her to cough. "You're lucky, my dear," she told her. "Unlike Stephen, you get a choice." "What do you mean?" Emily asked once she had stopped coughing. "You can either go along with everything that you have just learned and keep your own personality. Or?" Emily asked. "Or we will be forced to make some changes and alter your personality." "You can't do this," Emily shouted as she tried to struggle against her restraints, but it was no use. "Oh, but we can," Fiona told her. She motioned to the scientists and they all moved, starting to attach wires to Emily's brain. "So what will it be, Mrs. Thompson?" Emily struggled a bit more before stopping. Maybe she could play along for a while as she tried to work out a way to stop the brainwashing? Defeated, she looked up at Fiona. "Fine," she said. "I'll do it." "Excellent," Fiona said, and she snapped her fingers. The scientists stopped what they were doing and then started to pack away all the equipment. One of them untied Emily and she sat up, rubbing her wrists. "Welcome aboard," Fiona said, shaking Emily's hand. She looked her up and down before shaking her head. "But first, we'll have to get you out of that ridiculous clothing," she said. Chapter 11. Fiona had insisted on accompanying Emily to local mall. Emily suspected that she wanted to make sure that she didn't run away. They had taken Emily's car and headed to the mall. There they were met by none other than Gemma Rhodes. She smiled at them as they got out. "Emily, my girl," she said rather loudly. "So glad that we could come to an understanding," she said. "It would have been a shame to have to lose that wonderful mind of yours." Both Fiona and Gemma laughed while Emily just offered them a weak smile. She figured that she'd just bide her time until she figured a way out of here. As they wandered through the mall, Emily noticed that a few patrons were out and about. She took a close look as one passed by quickly, and sure enough, it was a man. What worried her was that the man had long blonde hair and he wore a dress. They all did. Was this what was to become of her husband? She had to get him out of here. The first store that they approached was a barber shop. Like all the other shops, this one was owned by a woman. She wore a white tank top along with denim jeans. It looked like she worked out a lot as her top showed off her muscles. "Morning, Sarah," Fiona said as they entered. Sarah looked up. "Morning, Mrs. Masters, Mrs. Rhodes." "New customer?" she asked as she returned her attention to the customer currently sitting in her chair. "Indeed," Fiona said. "This is Emily Thompson. She's going to be the manager of the new store." Sarah looked up again. "Is she now?" "My husband will be happy," she told them. "He's been going on about this new store for weeks. I tell you, Mrs. Thompson," she added, pointing at Emily, "you're going to make a lot of the men around here very happy." "I'm happy to help," Emily managed to get out weakly. She was just too stunned to say anything else. Sarah finished up her customer, who got up and paid for her service. The woman then took a hat off the coat rack and put it on. She tipped it towards the three women as she left. "Now what can I do for you?" Sarah asked as Fiona pushed Emily towards the chair. Chapter 12. How's that? Sarah asked as she showed Emily her work in the mirror. Emily opened her mouth to say something, but Fiona interrupted. "I think she looks very handsome now." "Don't you, Gemma?" Fiona asked her companion. "Oh yes, very handsome indeed," Gemma said with a grin. Gemma walked up to the till and left a large wad of cash. "Thank you very much, ma'am," Sarah the barber said as the three women left. Emily could do nothing but follow the two women. She was stunned. Her beautiful blonde hair had been cut short and dyed black. When she saw herself in the mirror, she looked like a man. Their next destination was a clothing store. Emily stood there while Fiona and Gemma picked out what they thought would be suitable clothes for her. These included polo shirts, jeans, and trousers. They even brought her a new watch and a wallet. Again, Gemma paid for the purchases, leaving a similar amount of cash on the desk, much to the employees' delight. They then went and brought some shoes for Emily. Once they had brought everything that they needed, Fiona and Gemma made Emily change into her new clothes, each nodding in approval when she came out. Once they had finished shopping, Fiona and Gemma helped load all of the purchases into Emily's car, and then they drove back to the store. Emily couldn't believe that she was expected to work after all that had just gone on. Fiona and Gemma introduced Emily to all the members of staff, mostly women, and then left, leaving Emily to process what had just happened. Chapter 13. Emily sighed as she got into her car at the end of the day. It had been a weird day. First, she learned about the truth of Stepford and what was going on here, then she was given a choice. A choice to which Emily felt that she had no reason other than to accept. At least until she could figure a way out of this place. Emily spent the rest of the day pretending to play along while she came up with an escape plan. When she got home, she would grab Stephen, and then, under the cover of darkness, they would drive out of here. Maybe they could find a doctor or scientist who could reverse whatever programming that Stephen had been subjected to. Emily turned the engine on only to hear a loud bang and see smoke coming out of the engine. Great! Emily thought to herself as she got out. There goes that plan. She opened up the bonnet only to be covered in smoke. She coughed. What's up, Mrs. T? Emily heard through the smoke. She stepped away from the engine and saw Stacy standing there. Stacy was one of her younger employees fresh out of school. Her clothes and hairstyle were in the latest trends. Emily sighed. My car's broken down, she explained. No problem, Mrs. T. Stacy whipped out her mobile and dialed a number. Hello? Yes, we've got a broken down car here outside the new store. Great, thanks. Putting her phone away, Stacy explained that the mechanic was on her way with a tow truck. Thanks, Emily said. Now, what was she going to do? If you'd like, I can give you a lift home, Stacy offered. Sure, Emily replied. They waited for mechanic to arrive. When she did, she got out of her truck and inspected the engine. The mechanic wore blue overalls and was covered in dirt and oil stains. Emily noted that she didn't have any hair on her head, and like the barber, she worked out. After a while, the mechanic came over to them with a grim look on her face. It's a tough job, I'm afraid, she told them. She explained all the details, but to Emily, not knowing much about cars, it went straight over her head. It's going to take a few weeks, the mechanic finished as she looked at them waiting for a response. A few weeks! Emily exclaimed, shocked. How am I supposed to get around? She asked. Well, we have a car rental service. It's nothing spectacular, but it'll get you to A and B, the mechanic replied. I suppose that it'll have to do then, won't it? Emily replied, shaking her head. What was she going to tell Stephen? The mechanic returned to her truck to get some paperwork. Emily filled it in, including giving her new address. She then handed the mechanic her keys. I just need to get a few things out of the boot first, Emily told the woman. The woman nodded as she watched Emily and Stacy get her new purchases and transfer them into Stacy's car. We'll be round shortly to drop off the hire car, the mechanic told them. Emily just nodded as they drove off. Chapter 14. Wow, Mrs. T. Stacy exclaimed as they pulled up outside Emily's home. Is this place yours? She asked. Emily nodded and Stacy whistled. Thanks for the lift, she told the girl. Anytime, Mrs. T. Do you want me to help you with the bags? She asked, but Emily shook her head. No, thanks. I can manage it from here. No problem, Mrs. T. See you tomorrow. Stacy waited until Emily had unloaded before she sped off like all teenagers do. I guess some things never change, Emily said as she watched the car disappear. Emily picked up her bags and headed to her house. After fumbling with her keys for a moment, she finally opened the door and dropped her bags in the hall. Honey! I'm home, she called out, but she got no response, although she did hear some voices coming from the living room and, to her surprise, a couple of giggles. Intrigued, Emily made her way to the room. Now who's this handsome fellow? She heard as she entered the room. Inside the living room, she found her husband talking with another man, only the man was all dressed up like a 1950s housewife. Both men were giggling. That's my wife, Emily, Stephen told the man rather proudly with a little giggle. The man got up and hurried over excitedly. Ooh, Stephen's told me all about you, he said, gushing. But I had no idea that you were so handsome. Emily just stood there confused. Oh goodness, where are my manners? The man asked himself. He held out his hand daintily. I'm Richard Goodman. Natalie's husband. Emily took the man's hand and shook it. Oh, yes, we met your wife last night. Richard nodded. I do wish that I could have been there as well, but one of my friend's wife is pregnant, so we were holding a baby shower for him. Emily looked at Stephen, who seemed in a bit of a daze. Goodness, is that the time? Richard asked, noticing Emily's watch. He turned to Stephen. Stephen dear, I must be off. Natalie will be expecting her dinner anytime soon. I'll see you again tomorrow? Stephen in a haze nodded slowly. Excellent, Richard said smiling, and with that he saw himself out. What the hell was going on? Emily yelled once she heard the front door close. That seemed to break Stephen out of his daze. Huh? What do you mean? He asked, clearly not remembering all of the details. I come home from work to find you and another giggling like a pair of girls. Stephen shook his head, trying to clear the cobwebs. You're right, he said, remembering. I don't what happened, he told her. I came home from the shopping and Richard offered to help unload everything, and then the next thing I know, you're here. Emily calmed down. It wasn't Stephen's fault. It was that stupid programming. It seemed that whenever he spent time with someone he would lapse into his new personality, however far along. She sat down next to him and put her arm around him. I'm sorry, sweetie, she told him. I'm sorry I ever agreed to come here. Stephen shook his head. It's not your fault, honey, he replied. You didn't know what was going to happen to us. Besides, you're home now. So we can try and escape, he said hopefully. Emily sighed. I'm sorry, honey. The car broke down this afternoon. It's going to be in the shop for a while. Stephen looked crestfallen. Hey, come on now, Emily told him. We can work through this, she said. Together we'll figure something out. Stephen nodded and then he looked at her. What happened to your clothes? He asked. Chapter 15. Emily was about to tell him what had happened this morning when the doorbell rang. She looked out of the window and saw the mechanic outside. That's mechanic with the hire car, she told Stephen. Stephen got up, smoothed his shirt out and then checked his appearance in the mirror. Something, Emily noted, that he never did. Sighing, Emily watched as he went to open the door. Oh, hello. You must be Mr. Thompson, the mechanic said as Stephen opened the door. Yes, that's me, Stephen replied. Is your wife around? The woman asked. I need her to sign some documents, she explained. Stephen nodded. Of course, he called Emily over and she entered the hallway. I'll leave you two to it, Stephen told them. Lovely home you have, ma'am, the mechanic told Emily. Thanks, Emily replied bluntly. Let's just get this over with. The mechanic showed Emily the car first. It wasn't as beaten down as Emily thought that it might be, but it wasn't fancy either though, it was kind of in between. Emily was then given the paperwork which she signed and the mechanic then handed the keys to her. Emily saw the mechanic off before heading back inside. To her surprise, she could smell something cooking. Stephen rarely cooked, that job usually fell to her. So she went into the kitchen to see what was up. I thought I'd get started on dinner, Stephen explained as Emily entered. It's getting rather late. Emily looked at her new watch and decided that he did have a point. I chose steak, Stephen told her. I at least know how to cook that, Emily laughed. I'm sorry, honey. I hadn't realized how late it was. Thank you for taking over. Stephen nodded as he turned his attention back to the dinner. Emily decided to retreat into the living room while dinner was being cooked. Chapter 16. It was Emily's turn to sleep not so soundly that night. She lay awake thinking about what they were doing to her husband, and herself for that matter. She also tried to think of ways that they could escape. Sure, they could take the hire car, but Emily had a feeling that they could probably track it somehow. Walking was out of the question. It was too far to the nearest town and they'd be caught before they even got halfway. Eventually, Emily drifted off into an uneasy sleep. When Emily awoke the next morning, she found Stephen's side of the bed empty. Normally she woke before he did. She went into the bathroom to get dressed and momentarily surprised herself when she caught herself in the mirror. She was still a bit sleepy and it took a few moments before she remembered what had happened yesterday. That's going to take some getting used to, she thought to herself as she stepped into the shower. After her shower, Emily got dressed in her new clothes and then headed downstairs for breakfast. She was a bit worried about leaving Stephen on his own. Worried about what she might come home to, but what could she do? Entering the kitchen, she found Stephen at the table having his breakfast. Couldn't sleep? She asked, trying to start a conversation. Stephen shook his head. I slept fine, he told her. I just woke up early for some reason and I couldn't get back to sleep, so I thought I'd get breakfast ready. Emily smiled. She had to admit. It was nice not having to worry about these things. As Emily poured herself some cereal, Stephen got up and poured a cup of coffee for her. It took them a moment before they both realized that Emily normally did this for Stephen. They both started to say something, but then the doorbell rang. I'll get it, Stephen announced. He had finished his breakfast anyway, so he headed out into the hall. Stephen checked his appearance in the mirror before he caught himself. He shook his head and answered the door. Oh, hello, dear. Lovely day, isn't it? Richard asked as Stephen opened the door. Today Richard wore a flower-printed circle skirt. On his arm hung a white handbag and he wore matching gloves. On his feet he wore white pumps. Richard's blonde hair was perfectly styled into an elegant updo. Yes, I suppose it is, Stephen replied, staring at Richard's clothing choice. He coughed. If you don't mind. I actually don't feel too well today, he feigned, hoping that Richard would take the bait, but Richard shook his head. Nonsense, my dear, he said. You look fine. A bit pale, but we can fix that. At that point, Emily appeared, having finished her breakfast. Oh, hello, Richard, she said once she saw who it was. Hello, handsome, Richard replied with a giggle, causing Emily to blush. I was going to take Stephen out for the day, do some shopping. That sort of thing, Richard told her. I hope you don't mind, he asked. Really, Emily did mind. She didn't want her husband prancing around in dresses acting like a woman. But what could she do? So she shook her head. No, not at all, she said. Now, if you'll excuse me. I'm going to be late for work. Don't let us keep you, dear, Richard said with a wink. Both Stephen and Richard waved Emily off. Once Emily had disappeared, Richard turned to Stephen. Let's get started, shall we? He asked. Chapter 17. Let's get started, shall we? Richard asked Stephen gleefully. Stephen sighed. I've got to clear the table, he said, trying to stall him. Based on what had happened last time, Stephen wanted to spend as little time as possible with the man, but Richard shook his head and placed a gloved hand gently on Stephen's shoulder. Oh, don't worry about that, dear, he said with a smile. I can help you with that, and he almost barged in, taking his gloves off as he did so. Stephen shook his head as he watched Richard place his gloves and bag on the table in the hall before moving into the kitchen. Stephen followed him. To his surprise, Richard was running water in the sink. He fumbled in the cupboards before he found what he was looking for, washing up liquid. We have a dishwasher, Stephen pointed out. Richard nodded. I know, dear, but I prefer to do them by hand, he told Stephen. Besides, it's good practice for you. He gestured for Stephen to come closer. Come here, I'll show you. Stephen realized that he was about to get his first lesson in housekeeping. Richard picked up the bowls from the table and then placed them in the sink. He then showed Stephen what to do. When they had finished, Richard placed them on the rack to dry. There. Now that that's done, we can go shopping, Richard said. He left the kitchen to pick up his bag and put on his gloves. What did you have in mind? Stephen asked, fearing the answer. Well, dear, seeing as your wife got some new clothes, I think that it's time that you did as well. After all, don't you want to fit in? Richard asked. Stephen shook his head and backed away. You mean wear a dress like you? He asked. No way. I'm not dressing up like a sissy, he said. Richard looked a little hurt, but then he composed himself and placed his maid on his hips. I'm afraid that you don't have much of choice, dear. Didn't they explain all of that to you? He shook his head. Oh, you poor thing. You know about the programming? Stephen asked. Richard replied, nodding. Every so often we get an outsider and they remind us of the process. Everyone gets paired with a newcomer to help ease them into their new roles, Richard explained, getting rather excited. This is the first time that I've been paired with anyone. He clapped his gloved hands excitedly. This is going to be fun, he said before composing himself and checking his appearance in the mirror. Stephen sighed. Great, he thought to himself. So I'm stuck with him. Come on then, dear, Richard said, and he took Stephen's hand and led him out of the house. Chapter 18. Stephen tried to resist, but Richard was relentless as he dragged his companion over to the mall. Stephen was worried that he might lapse into his feminine persona again, so he tried his best to focus. All the way Richard gossiped about how much fun they were going to have, and he promised to introduce Stephen to all of his friends once he was ready. Whatever that meant. Their first stop, much to Stephen's dismay, was the salon. There were groups of men all similarly dressed to Richard chatting away, but they all stopped and stared when they entered. Richard excitedly explained that Stephen was new in town and that he needed a makeover. One of the younger men, a teenager, rushed over as fast as his high heels could carry him and gestured for Stephen to sit down. Don't worry, Mr. Goodman, the young man said. We'll make him beautiful. Now what color shall we go for? He asked. Blonde? Richard shook his head. No, dear, I don't think so. We don't want people to think that he's some sort of himbo now, do we? He asked. The young man giggled. Oh, of course not. What was I thinking? He paused for a moment, giving it some thought. I know, he said suddenly. How about a redhead? Everyone loves redheads. Richard considered it for a moment and then nodded. Yes, I think that'll work. It seemed that Stephen would be getting no say in the matter. My name's Andrew, by the way, the man said, introducing himself. But everyone calls me Candy. Richard nodded and let Candy get on with his work. As he did so, he started gossiping away. Stephen tried to get a word in, but Candy went on and on. He talked about his family, then he talked about his hunk of a girlfriend, Stacy, who had just graduated from school and actually now worked for Stephen's wife. Stephen started to grow bored and drifted off. All done, honey, Candy announced, waking Stephen up from his daze. Stephen took a look at his reflection in the mirror and gasped. I think he likes it, Candy said proudly. Stephen hated to admit it, but he looked stunning. In fact, he hardly recognized himself. His once short black hair had been completely transformed. It was now a dark red and had been styled into a beehive. Stephen also noticed that he was wearing makeup. He wore dark blue eyeshadow, and over his lips he wore a thick coat of dark red lipstick. "So dear," Richard said, coming up behind him. "What do you think?" Stephen just sat there in shock, but a small part of him wanted to admit that he liked it. Candy took the cover off him and allowed him to stand up. That was when Stephen noticed that they had done his nails as well. They were now a few inches longer, and he noted that they were painted in the same shade as his lipstick. "What?" he asked, stunned as he looked at his hands. "I don't see what the problem is, sweetie," Richard said as he paid Candy for a job well done. "You asked for them." "I what?" Stephen replied. He would have remembered if he had, wouldn't he? Richard nodded. "As Candy was doing your hair, you sat up and asked if you could have your nails done like mine," Richard explained, holding up his own hands to demonstrate. Stephen's were done exactly like his. "Stupid programming," Stephen muttered as he realized what must have happened. "There's no point fighting it, sweetie," Richard told him. "Everyone succumbs to it eventually," he said as they left the salon. Chapter 19. Stop touching it. Richard told Stephen as he kept fiddling with his new hair. "You'll ruin all the work Candy did." "Sorry," Stephen said glumly. Candy must have used a lot of hairspray on his new hairdo, as he could still smell it. He stopped dead when he saw where they were headed next. "I can't go in there," he said to Richard. "Why ever not, dear?" Richard asked. "This shop caters to men only." "Of course you can." He took Stephen's hand and dragged him into the store past the display board that read Victor's Secret. Stephen felt embarrassed as Richard led down aisles and aisles of lingerie. Richard chatted on as he picked out pairs of bras, panties, girdles, and stockings. They even picked out some nightwear, including a pink see-through baby doll and a pink fluffy bathrobe. To further Stephen's embarrassment, Richard made him try on every piece of item they brought. He also insisted that Stephen showed him what they looked like on him. Stephen's face went red as he went into the changing rooms and got changed into a lacy black bra and panty set. Richard whistled as Stephen showed himself and announced that Stephen would wear that out of the shop. Stephen felt weird after walking out of the shop dressed in his normal clothes but wearing makeup, a bra and panties, and with his hair all done up. Stephen should have realized that that feeling wasn't going to last, though. Their next destination was a clothing store. The very same one that Stephen had found himself standing outside of yesterday. Today he found himself drawn to the same window display which held the yellow dress. "It is really pretty, isn't it?" Richard asked him, coming up beside him. Stephen nodded slowly. "Great. We'll buy you one." They must have tried on every dress in the shop, Stephen mused. They ranged from short dresses to long dresses, casual to formal. Stephen never knew that there were so many different types. He also learned, as Richard explained, that different dresses were suited for certain occasions while others weren't. He also learned that he would have coordinated his underwear with the piece of clothing that he planned on wearing. They eventually came out of the store carrying dozens of shopping bags between them. Again, Richard insisted that Stephen should wear one of his purchases out of the store. They decided on a red and white polka dot house dress. Richard had chosen it because it matched his hair and nails. Richard had shown Stephen how to wear pantyhose, so he also wore a pair that was in black. They had brought several pairs of shoes as well. Stephen was now wearing, much to his dismay, a pair of black 2-inch heels. Richard had showed him how to walk in heels, although he stifled a laugh when Stephen stumbled on his first go. "Oh, don't worry, sweetie. he said, lowering his hand from his mouth. You'll get used to it. I doubt it, Stephen muttered quietly so that Richard wouldn't hear. He was beginning to wonder if this trip would ever end when they stopped outside a small cafe. Let's stop for lunch, shall we? Richard asked. I don't know about you, but I'm hungry. Stephen nodded in agreement. He had no idea what the time was, but he guessed that it must be lunchtime. The cafe was starting to fill up with other patrons. They both sat down at a nearby table and placed their many shopping bags around them. Richard scolded Stephen as he sat down, reminding the confused man that he needed to sit like a gentleman. Richard made him stand up and then showed him how to sit by smoothing his skirt out first and then cross his legs afterwards. Stephen sighed as he followed Richard's instructions. Once they had sat down, a waiter came over to take their order. He was a young lad, no older than Candy back at the salon, and Stephen had to admit that he looked very pretty. Stephen didn't get much choice in his order as Richard ordered them both a skinny latte and a salad. Richard explained to him that he would now have to keep an eye on his diet if he wanted to stay pretty to Emily. Something which deep inside of Stephen appealed to him. Once their meals arrived, Richard then showed Stephen how to eat, taking small bites and being careful not to smudge his makeup. This was getting to be all a bit too much for Stephen. Well, sweetie, Richard said as they ate their meal. I think that it's time to show off the new you. Don't you? He asked. Stephen looked shocked. What do you mean? He replied, fearing the answer. I suggest that we all get together for dinner tonight, Richard suggested. I'll show how to cook and be a proper host to our wives. I can't let Emily see me like this, Stephen said. What would she think? Well, I'd think that she would think that you look stunning, Richard told him with a smile. He placed a hand gently on Stephen's arm, leaning into him. And I would have to agree, he said. In fact, I'd even say that you look better than me. Stephen blushed and playfully batted Richard's hand away. Oh, stop, he said, giggling, and then he looked at his friend. You really think so? Richard nodded. This made Stephen feel really good inside. Perhaps it wasn't all bad to be beautiful. Chapter 20. The two men spent the rest of the afternoon shopping for accessories. They giggled and gossiped as they browsed through the many items on sale. Stephen had unwittingly slipped into his new persona and was having a ball. Ooh, he squealed as he spotted something on display. Look at this, he said, calling Richard over. Oh, sweetheart. It looks wonderful, Richard said as he saw what Stephen was holding. It was a beautiful silver necklace that had a heart-shaped pendant. Do you think that Emily will like it? Stephen asked as he tried it on. Sweetie, I think she will love it, Richard replied honestly, causing both men to giggle. They made several more purchases which they placed inside their other bags, and then when it was time for them to go home, Richard pulled out his mobile. I'm calling a cab, he explained. Good idea, Stephen said, nodding. Richard ordered a taxi, and then the two men went and found somewhere to sit and wait. They didn't have to wait long as a cab soon pulled up. The men started to pick up their bags, but the driver, a pleasant-looking woman, got out and came over to help them. Oh, thank you, Richard told her as she took several bags. You are sweet. Once the bags were all in the boot, Richard thanked the woman again by kissing her on the cheek. This caused the woman to blush and shocked Stephen. But Richie, he said. You're married. Richard told Stephen to keep his voice down. I know, but it doesn't hurt to tease them once in a while, he explained. A stunning young man such as yourself will find that you'll get a lot more favors from women if you do. This was a revelation to Stephen, and he pondered what Richard had told him on the ride home. Maybe he could tease Emily a bit? They arrived at Stephen's house and the woman again helped them with their bags to the front door. Again Richard kissed the woman on the cheek and then he looked at Stephen expectantly. Stephen got the message. He strode over to the woman stumbling a bit in his heels, placed an arm over her shoulder and gave her a big wet kiss. This action caused the woman to stumble backwards, blushing a deep red from cheek to cheek. She quickly hurried back to her cab. "How was that?" Stephen asked, turning to Richard. He was confused when he saw his friend trying hard not to laugh. "I think that you overdid it a bit," Richard said, and he burst out laughing. Stephen grinned as they picked up their bags and headed inside. Chapter 21. "I've called Natalie and let her know that we're having dinner over here," Richard said as he re-entered the bedroom where Stephen was finishing unpacking. Richard looked at his watch. "That gives us about 4 hours to get ready," he told Stephen. "Get ready?" Stephen asked as he looked down at himself. "I thought that I was ready," he said. "Oh, sweetie," Richard replied, shaking his head. No. "You can't wear the same dress that you've been wearing all day," he said. He went over to Stephen's newly filled wardrobe. They had thrown out all of Stephen and Emily's old clothes and started browsing. "Aha," he said after some searching and pulling out his selection. Sticking with the red theme, he had chosen a silk off-the-shoulder party dress with short sleeves. He then went over to a set of drawers and picked out a red bra and panty set. Laying them on the bed next to the dress, he looked up at Stephen. "Go and take a shower, but be careful not to get your hair wet, and then put these on," Richard told him. Stephen was about to enter the bathroom when Richard motioned for him to wait. Richard rummaged through one of the bags and picked out a pink razor and some cream. "Make sure to shave every hair off your body," Richard instructed. Stephen took the items, nodded, and entered the bathroom. Once he had showered, Stephen peeked around the door. "Can you hand me my underwear?" he asked his friend. Richard shook his and pushed the door open. "Come on, dear, there's no need to be ashamed. We're friends, aren't we?" Stephen nodded and slowly stepped out. He wasn't used to this sort of intimacy between males as he stood there in the nude in front of Richard. Richard handed him the panties and Stephen slipped them on. He then helped Stephen with the bra, telling to take notes because he would have to put it on himself later. Stephen then put on the dress, which zipped up at the back, so Richard helped him with that as well. Next came the makeup. Richard sat Stephen down at the vanity table, which used to be Emily's, and showed him how to do his makeup. At the jeweler's store, they had got Stephen's ears pierced, and so they selected a pair of white pearl-shaped earrings and a matching necklace. "There," Richard said as he stepped back to admire his handiwork. Stephen looked at himself and squealed. "Oh my God, Richie," he said, posing this way and that. "I look amazing." Richard nodded in appreciation. "Now why don't you go downstairs and put the oven on?" Richard suggested. "I need to head home and get changed myself," Stephen nodded as he got up. Slipping into a pair of red heels, he headed downstairs. While he waited for Richard to return, Stephen decided to let Emily know of their plans. He went to fetch his purse and got out his mobile, and then he dialed Emily's number. "Hi, sweetie," he said in a breathy tone when Emily answered. "Stephen?" Emily replied, sounding confused. "Are you all right? You sound different." Stephen just giggled. "I'm fine, honey. Richie and I were talking and we decided to have dinner at our house tonight," Stephen explained. "I hope that's okay with you?" he asked, hoping that he hadn't crossed a line. There was a pause before Emily replied. That's fine, honey. Great. Stephen replied happily. Richie and I will cook you the best meal you've ever tasted, he told her, wanting to impress her. Oh, and honey, he added. What? I've got a surprise for you, he giggled and hung up, leaving Emily to wonder what was going on and what Stephen's surprise was. Chapter 22. Emily couldn't concentrate at work that afternoon. She was worried about Stephen, worried that he had slipped into his new persona again after spending all day with Richard, worried what she might find when she got home. So as soon as her shift had ended, she almost ran to her car, which caused her braless chest to bounce freely. When she had been given her makeover, Fiona had explained how it was the men who wore bras, not the women. This had confused Emily a bit because men don't really need bras, but at the time she was in no position to question the logic. She got to her car, started it up and drove as quickly as she could home. After parking in the drive, she rushed to door and flung it open. There she quickly came to a stop as her jaw dropped to the ground. Standing in the hallway in front of her, giggling and holding a bunch of flowers, was Stephen. But this was not the Stephen that she recognized. His hair had been dyed a dark red and styled into a beehive. The red party dress fit him like a glove. Wow, was all that Emily could say. She was speechless. This apparent reaction was what Stephen had been hoping for, and he squealed excitedly. Oh, Richie, he called. She likes it. She really likes it, he giggled again, put the flowers down and rushed over to his wife. He then put his arms around her shoulders and gave a big wet kiss on the lips, stunning Emily. Of course she does, honey, Richard, or Richie, said as he came out of the kitchen. He too was dressed similarly to Stephen, only his dress was pink and he currently wore a pink fluffy apron over it. What woman wouldn't like that? He said, proud of his handiwork. A gay one, Stephen wittingly replied, causing both men to burst into fits of laughter. Oh, Steffi. You are quick, Richard said as he regained his composure. Now why don't you see to our wives and then come and help me with the casserole? Of course, Stephen said, still giggling a little. He took Emily's coat off and hung it on the coat rack. He then led Emily into the living room where Emily saw Richard's wife Natalie already there. She nodded at Emily as she entered. Natalie was currently holding a glass of cherry in her hand and there were some nibbles on the coffee table in front of her. Now, honey? Stephen asked as Emily sat down. What would you like to drink? She'll have the same as me, please, love, Natalie replied for her. She could tell that Emily was too stunned to reply. Stephen nodded. He even gave a little curtsy as he left. Natalie chuckled. This wasn't what you were expecting, was it? She asked Emily as she reached for some nuts. Emily slowly shook her head slowly, trying to come to grips with it all. Chapter 23. This wasn't what you were expecting, was it? She asked Emily as she reached for some nuts. Emily slowly shook her head slowly, trying to come to grips with it all. Don't worry, Natalie said with a smile. You'll get used to it. Stephen returned a few minutes later with Emily's drink. While he had been in the kitchen, he had donned an apron similar to Richard's. Emily watched with a mixture of fascination and shock as Richard handed her drink. He gave Emily a wink as he did so. As he headed back to the kitchen, Emily noticed that Stephen stumbled a couple of times. He doesn't realize what he is doing, does he? Emily asked as she took a sip of her drink. Natalie shook her head. Well, I suppose on some level he does. The programming doesn't completely remove his personality or his memories. It just enforces our ideals onto him and makes him want to comply. Natalie then continued to explain how the process worked and how each newcomer was given a partner to reinforce the programming. Emily just sat and listened as she took in everything that she said. There must be some way to reverse it, Emily said to herself, but she must have said it too loudly because Natalie chuckled. I don't think so, she said as she passed the nibbles to Emily, looking at her suspiciously. No one has found a way to yet, she told her. Emily continued to ponder this new information as they sat there drinking and nibbling. I have to get Stephen away from Richard, she thought. She was distracted from her thoughts when Stephen and Richard both entered the room and curtsied. Dinner is ready, they announced. Excellent, Natalie said. She gave a sniff as she stood up. It smells wonderful. Richard accepted the compliment as Stephen blushed. Chapter 24. It was getting quite late by the time the Goodmans decided to leave. Both Emily and Stephen saw them out, with Stephen helping Natalie with her coat. Well, thank you for a wonderful evening, she said after she had straightened it out. Yes, it was really lovely, Richard added. We should do this again soon. Oh, and that casserole was amazing, Natalie told Stephen. She took his hand and kissed it. Stephen blushed. Thank you, he said, giggling. But really, Richard did all the work, I just helped out, Stephen told her modestly. Natalie nodded. Come along, dear, she said to Richard, and as they turned to leave she slipped her arm around Richard's waist. Stephen closed the door and then turned to face Emily. He had a rather seductive look on his face. And now, honey. It's time for your surprise. For a moment Emily wondered what the surprise was, but she shook her head. No, she said firmly, catching Stephen by surprise. This has to stop, she told him. Stephen, you're not acting like yourself. But Stephen, who was under the influence, looked at her coyly. That's because I want you, baby, he said in a breathy tone. Emily shook her head. She grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him. Come on, honey, wake up, she said. Stephen tried to kiss her, but she shook him again and slapped him in the face. That seemed to do the trick. Stephen looked shocked for a moment, and then he shook his head and looked at himself. Oh my God! What am I wearing? He asked out loud. He then looked at Emily. I can't believe that I was acting like that, he said. I'm sorry, honey, he said apologetically. It's not your fault, Stephen, Emily said, trying to comfort him. It's that stupid programming. I can't control it, Stephen told her, breaking down. Every time I'm alone or spend time with Richard, the first seem lose control. Emily nodded. She put her arms around him. I know, honey. Natalie told me how it works. What are we going to do? Stephen asked, sniffing a little. I don't know, Emily replied, shaking her head. Then suddenly she stopped. You know what? She asked. Stephen looked at her. Screw it. Let's take the hire car and get out of here. Really? Stephen asked, unsure. Yep, Emily replied firmly. She then looked at him. But first, let's get you out of that ridiculous clothing. She took his hand and led him upstairs. Emily quickly ran up the stairs with Stephen in tow. She went into their bedroom and opened their wardrobe only to find. I'm sorry, Stephen sobbed. I forgot. Richard and I threw everything out. Natalie sighed. We'll have to go as we are then, she told him. Stephen looked at her fearfully. But what happens when we get to civilization? He asked. What if someone sees? We'll figure that out when we get there, Emily said, interrupting him. Stephen thought for a moment but nodded. Emily took his hand again and they rushed downstairs, grabbing the car keys as they went. Emily helped Stephen into the car. He automatically smoothed his skirt out before he sat down. Emily didn't say anything. She got in and started the car up. As they drove through the small town, Emily kept looking in the mirror to see if they were being followed, but it appeared that they weren't. They entered the narrow road, which was the only way out, and they both breathed a sigh of relief as they thought that they were in the clear. Their relief was premature, however, as they rounded a corner a car was coming the other way. Emily swerved to avoid it, but they ended crashing into one of the many bushes that lined the road. Chapter 25. Emily groaned as she slowly came to. She blinked, trying to adjust as she opened her eyes. She was in a dimly lit room. She lifted her head and after a few moments, she realized that she was in the same room that she had been in when she first arrived in Stepford. That seemed like a lifetime ago. Emily realized that this time she was lying down. She tried to sit up but found that she had been restrained. Her struggle must have made some noise because Fiona Masters soon appeared in her vision. "Where's Stephen?" she asked, concerned, struggling again. "He's all right," Fiona assured her. "He suffered a bump to the head in the crash, but other than that he's all right." "Crash?" Emily asked, still a bit dazed. Fiona nodded. "Yes. It seems that the two of you were in rather a hurry last night, weren't you?" she asked Emily. Emily stopped struggling and looked at Fiona, who tooted. "My poor dear," she said as she began pacing. "Didn't we tell you what would happen if you tried to resist?" She looked at Emily and shook her head. Emily realized what she meant by that and suddenly grew worried. "Please," she said. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again, I promise." Fiona shook her head again as she lit a cigar. "I'm sorry, dear, but I can't take any chances. Especially now that I know that I can't trust you." She snapped her fingers and the machines in the room began to hum. "I can only hope," Fiona said as she leaned towards Emily, blowing a cloud of smoke in her face. "That your personality doesn't get altered too much," she said as she leaned away. "I rather like you." "Wait!" Emily shouted, but it was no use. Fiona ignored her and had closed the doors behind her, leaving Emily in the dimly lit room alone with the machines. Chapter 26. Stephen was in the waiting room of the hospital when Richard found him. He rushed over to him. "Oh, sweetie," Richard said, feeling sorry for the man. He was a mess. His hair was all disheveled and his dress wrinkled. His makeup was ruined as well because he had been crying. Richard sat down next to him and handed him a tissue out of his purse. "I came as soon as I heard," Richard told his friend. Stephen nodded as he blew into the tissue and dabbed his eyes. "Have you been here all night?" Richard asked. Stephen nodded. "Once they had seen to me. They let me go," he explained. "But I didn't want to go without Emily," he added. Richard nodded. "They told me that they had to keep her overnight, but they didn't say why." "I know, honey," Richard said as he pulled Richard into a hug. Little did Stephen know that they had both been subjected to the programming again and that Richard was there to reinforce it. "Do you want something to drink? Tea, coffee?" Richard asked. Stephen nodded and ordered a coffee. Richard got up and went to find the nearest machine. While Stephen waited for Richard to return, the door to Emily's room opened and the doctor came out. Stephen stood up immediately. "How is she, doctor?" Stephen asked, fearing the worst, but the doctor's warm smile seemed to comfort him. "She's fine," the doctor replied. A little shocked but nothing too serious, she told him. "We needed to keep her overnight to run some tests," she explained. Stephen nodded. "May I see her?" he asked. "Of course." Stephen nearly knocked the doctor over as he hurried in to see his wife. "Oh honey, I'm so glad that you're okay," Stephen said as he flung himself onto her. Emily coughed and then pushed him away slightly. "Whoa, steady on babe," she said, smiling at him. "You're crushing me," she chuckled. Stephen backed off, blushing. "Sorry," he said, grinning a little. "I'm just so happy that you're okay," Emily nodded. "I know, baby," she replied. "We had a little scare there, but fortunately we both came away unharmed." "Oh good, she's awake." Richard had returned with Stephen's coffee. He handed it to him and then placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Emily perked up a bit. "A lot better now that my two favorite men are here," she said, causing Richard to blush and giggle. "Oh, stop," he said, giggling as he gave Emily a playful push. They sat and talked with Emily for a bit before the doctor returned, telling them that Emily needed to rest. She also told them that Emily could be discharged that afternoon. This seemed to cheer Stephen up. "We'll head home and get cleaned up," Stephen told his wife. "And then we'll pick you up and I'll take good care of you," he promised as he gave Emily a little wink. "I can't wait," Emily replied with a smile. The two men left Emily alone to rest. Chapter 27. Natalie, who had taken the day off, was waiting for them in the car park. When she saw them exit the hospital, she got out and opened the doors for both of them. "How is she?" Natalie asked. "The doctor said that she's fine," Stephen explained. "They said that we could come and pick her up this afternoon." "That's great," Natalie replied as she started the car up and drove off. When they reached Stephen's house, Richard asked, "Do you want me to come in and help?" Stephen shook his head. "No thank you, I'll be fine." He got out and headed inside. Stephen wanted to make sure that he looked absolutely perfect for when his wife returned, and he also wanted to do it all by himself, so he headed upstairs. The first thing that Stephen needed to was to take a shower. He had spent all night in this dress and so it was wrinkled. Once in the bathroom, he peeled it off along with his bra and panties, then threw them in the hamper. After waiting for the water to get warm, Stephen then stepped into the shower, making sure to rub his body all over with that new strawberry-scented shower gel that he had brought. Then he washed his hair thoroughly, making sure to get rid of any tangles or knots. Finishing his shower, Stephen stepped out, making sure to cover his chest with a towel and then wrapped another around his hair, allowing it to dry. As he waited for his hair to dry, he decided to pick out his new clothes. He smiled as he picked out a lacy black bra and matching panties. He just knew that Emily would love these. Placing them on the bed, he then opened his wardrobe. After carefully selecting the appropriate outfit, he laid that out as well. He then set to work on his makeup. He made sure to use plenty of foundation to cover up the bruise on his forehead, and then, after applying the finishing coat of red lipstick, he blew himself a kiss in the mirror. Figuring that his hair was now dry, he removed his towel and then set to work. Once he had finished styling his hair, he stood up and then got dressed. Before he zipped up his dress, though, he gave himself a once-over in the floor-length mirror and nodded. The black wiggled dress hugged his figure, while the pleated twist sweetheart neckline gave a good view of his chest. You could just see a hint of the black lacy bra underneath. The pencil skirt showed off his legs nicely. His brunette-colored hair was of course elegantly styled into victory curls which showed off his diamond-shaped earrings, while his makeup was just as immaculate. Satisfied with his appearance, Stephen then reached behind him and zipped up his dress and then slipped into a pair of black ankle strap wedges. He then headed downstairs to make sure that everything would be just right for when Emily returned home. Stephen was just finishing dusting the living room when Natalie and Richard called round. He put the duster down, checked his appearance, and then answered the door. "Wow, Steffi!" Richard said in amazement. "You look absolutely stunning." Natalie nodded in agreement. Too stunned for words. "Thank you," Stephen replied, blushing a little. "Are you ready to go?" Richard asked. "Hold on," Stephen told his friend, and he bustled off into the kitchen. A few moments later he returned with a thermos flask. "I made a hot drink for Emily," he explained as they made their way to the car. "I know how horrible those hospital coffees can be." Chapter 28. Emily was discharged from the hospital later that afternoon. They had to wait a little while as the doctor had some paperwork to sort out. Then, after giving her a clean bill of health and recommending a lot of rest, with a wink towards Stephen, the doctor let her go. "Here you are, honey," Stephen said as he handed her a cup of coffee from his thermos. "Thanks, babe," Emily replied as she took a sip. "This is lovely," she told him with a smile. Stephen beamed and then he took her arm and helped to the car. Richard sat in the front while Natalie drove. Stephen snuggled up to Emily and couldn't help but fawn all over her, but Emily didn't seem to mind. In fact, she rather enjoyed all the attention. When they got home, Stephen ushered her into the living room and sat her down in an armchair facing the TV. He handed her the control and told her that she could watch anything that she wanted. Natalie came in and joined her. After flicking through the channels, Emily for some reason lingered on some football highlights. She wasn't normally a sports person, but the game looked quite entertaining, so she left it on. "Hey, babe?" Emily asked as she concentrated on the TV. "How about a beer for us girls?" "Of course, honey," Stephen said, and he hurried off to the kitchen before returning with 2 glasses of beer. "Thanks, babe," Emily said. She pulled Stephen close to her and gave him a passionate kiss which took his breath away. After breaking away from the kiss, Stephen giggled and then announced that he and Richard would get started on dinner. Emily nodded and gave Stephen a little slap on his behind as he turned away, causing him to let out a squeal of delight. Natalie watched all of this with a smile on her face. "What?" Emily asked as the 2 husbands headed into the kitchen. "Nothing," Natalie replied with a chuckle. She took a sip of her beer. "You seem to be rather enjoying yourself." "That's all." "Well, I should think that after all I've been through that I should be allowed to," she retorted. "Of course you are," Natalie replied. "I didn't say that it was wrong. I was just pointing it out." Emily was about to reply when one of the teams scored a goal. "Oh wow," Natalie commented. She was a football fan. "Did you see that?" Meanwhile, from the kitchen, Stephen smiled as he heard his wife cheer. "You seem happy," Richard commented as he laid the table. Stephen nodded. "I'm just glad that she's home safe," Stephen replied as he prepared the meat to go into the oven. Richard nodded. He had finished setting the table and moved on to the vegetables. "I know, dear," he replied with a smile. "Another beer, please, babe," Emily called from the living room. "All ready?" Stephen asked Richard, surprised. Richard just shrugged his shoulders while Stephen opened the fridge. When Stephen returned, Richard came up with a suggestion. "You know, I think that we're allowed a little treat ourselves, he said. What did you have in mind? Stephen asked. Richard opened the fridge again and pulled out a bottle of wine. Catching on, Stephen turned around and took a couple of wine glasses out of the cupboard behind him. Perching himself on the counter, Richard opened the bottle and poured the wine. Picking up his glass, he toasted to Stephen. To our good health, he said. To our handsome wives, Stephen replied, which caused both men to fall into fits of giggles.